Chapter 5 details the last night of Babylon's existence, the last night of the empire of gold, of God's statue, and Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the multi-metallic statue. That dream, by the way, was about coming Gentile kingdoms, with the last culminating in the Antichrist during the Great Tribulation period. A combined army of the Medes and Persians have surrounded the city. They represent the empire of silver in Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And before dawn, the empire of gold, the head of gold, the Babylonian empire will be gone, and the empire of silver will rule the world. Let's see how it happened. Verse 1, King Belshazzar held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and drank wine with them. Well, the first question may come to mind, who is Belshazzar? And that's a very good question. The second is, how did he get to be king? As you recall, the last chapter, in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar was still king, and so we wonder what happened. Well, to get that answer, we might go to something like Days of Our Lives as the World Turns, or Because What Happened sounds very much like a soap opera. Nebuchadnezzar, the most powerful dictator the world has ever known up until now, ascended to the throne when his father, Nabopolassar, died in 605. At that time, Nebuchadnezzar was besieging Jerusalem. He got word that his father died. We don't know the cause of his death, but he went back to Babylon, assumed the kingship, and reigned for 44 years until his death. Upon his death, he was succeeded by his son, Evil Merodach, evil being part of the name, not a characteristic, although he may have been. And he reigned for just 2 years before he was murdered by his brother-in-law, Neriglissar, who was, by the way, married to Nebuchadnezzar's daughter. You love it so far. Neriglissar reigned just 4 years before being killed in battle. He was succeeded by his son, Chad, who was Nebuchadnezzar's grandson, and he reigned just 9 months before he was murdered by Nabonidus, who, by the way, was married to Neriglissar's widow, who was also the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar. Love the story so far. As our story opens, the Medes and the Persians had joined forces in an effort to defeat Babylon. Nabonidus had reigned for 16 years. He had come out of the city to confront this combined army. He had been defeated. He fled the area, and he's now in hiding somewhere down in the Arabian desert, from what we understand. And so his son Belshazzar has been co-regent with him for about 5 years now. And although called king here, he is actually second in command. And later on, when we talk about him giving somebody third place in the kingdom, that's why Nabonidus is king, Belshazzar is second, and the other, to whomever it goes, would be third in the kingdom. Cyrus now has the city under siege. This was a common tactic of military maneuvers in those days. You would just simply come up around the city, surround it till they ran out of food and water and got weak and surrendered, or either you could come in and take over them. Belshazzar didn't seem to be too concerned that this combined army was just outside the city walls. I think part of the reason he had been told, and he obviously believed, that he was safe and secure behind the walls of Babylon. He had good reason to believe that, but he seemed to also be proud and defiant. It seems he feared no one, not Cyrus, not the Persians and the Medes, not the empire of silver, not even God. He even decided to show everyone how unafraid he was. So while this army is besieging his city, he throws a big party. He invites 1,000 nobles from his kingdom, and he brought out the best wine, and they drank together. Verse 1 says, King Belshazzar had a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles and drank in their presence. I don't know how large a banquet hall you've been to, but I tried to imagine what it would take to accommodate 1,000 men, plus wives, plus concubines, and whoever else attended, not to mention servants and all of those in attendance. Now, to kind of get this in perspective, if we go back and think about what Nebuchadnezzar had built, the city of Babylon covered 6 square miles. That's 3,840 acres, if you're a person that can identify with that. And we don't know the dimensions of the banquet room, but apparently it was quite large. Now, at the time of this big party, the combined army of the Medes and Persians was just outside the walls. Belshazzar didn't seem concerned because the city of Babylon was the greatest armed fortress in the world. It was also one of the most fantastic and greatest cities of all times. As we mentioned before, its famous Hanging Gardens was one of the 7 wonders of the world. The city was essentially laid out in a square, and all of this goes back to Nebuchadnezzar's building projects. And when I give you the dimensions and the size of this, you're going to wonder how long it took to do this, and how many people were involved in the construction of it. But as I said, the city was essentially laid out in a square with 2 walls. There was an outer wall and an inner wall. The outer wall was made with kiln-fired brick, and it was 311 feet high. Now, you ladies immediately identify that's just a little more than the length of a football field, which is 300 feet. Okay? It was 87 feet thick, 56 miles long, 14 all the way around, and it had a road on the top that would accommodate 6 chariots riding side by side. In addition to this, there were 250 towers stationed about the city, armed with sentries who were there on duty 24 hours a day. On the outside of this wall was a large moat or canal full of water, and it came right up to the wall, so it would have made it very difficult for people to try to scale the wall because they'd have to cross the moat first. Large drawbridges let down to allow people into the city, and then they were raised and locked so no one could get in. You begin to see why he felt so secure in this city. But also there was a second wall inside the first wall, and it had more soldiers. It also had a road on top for rapid deployment of troops if needed. The river Euphrates flowed under the walls of the city and went out the other side, and it provided a constant supply of drinking water. Several hundred acres of land had been set aside for farming and for raising cattle and other food that they might need. So they had food to last for years. They could raise more if it was needed. And at the time of Belshazzar's big feast, the ever-flowing Euphrates was full, flowing under the river. The moat was full. The walls were secure. The army was entrenched behind them. And he felt secure. And if he had any insecurities, he was going to prove to everybody in the world that he wasn't afraid, and so he threw a big party. It says, while he was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, and so that the king and his nobles, his wives and concubines, might drink from them. That happened in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, about 597 BC, when he brought those. But he had respect for them. He had put them aside. They had not been touched or utilized until this time. Now, you may be, if you picked up on what this said, his father Nebuchadnezzar, you may be thinking, well, maybe there's a little error in the Bible here, but let me clarify that for you. Nebuchadnezzar was actually Belshazzar's grandfather, not his father, as you might read into this. And the reason for that, in the original translation of this text, Aramaic, there is no word for grandfather or grandson. The word literally translates ancestor, okay? So the Bible is always correct, but in this text, it means that Belshazzar was a relative. Nebuchadnezzar was his ancestor, i.e. his grandfather, okay? You never know what you'll learn when you study that Bible, like Dan said, right? So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine. They praised the gods of gold, of silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Folks, this act was a grave sacrilege. It's hard to imagine how Belshazzar could have elected to do anything more unnecessary or stupid than what he did here. We see that he was a carefree reveler, an immoral polygamist, an arrogant blasphemer. When someone like Belshazzar has no relationship to God, all restraints are removed. We'll see that in the Great Tribulation period. But his celebration was more than just a party. It was part feast, part orgy, with the king drinking wine in front of his guests, and thus setting the example of drunkenness, sensuality, and revelry. Normally, in the East, in that culture, women were not allowed into gatherings like this. But as the revelry progressed, they were brought in to join the party. Old Belshazzar would be the life of the party until his own way of life would come to an abrupt end. But his foolishness didn't stop with the revelry. He added blasphemy and mockery to his list of sins. In his drunken stupor, he had them bring in these vessels taken from the temple, and then they added idolatrous worship to their debased behavior as they praised their gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. I think that was the crowning event in Belshazzar's contempt of God. They cloaked their sin as an act of worship and veiled their blasphemy in the name of religion. Keep in mind the prophetic nature of Daniel's book, the deliberate defiance of God, blasphemy, idolatry. All of this foreshadows the actions of the Antichrist and his false prophet during the tribulation period, which you can read in chapter 13 of Revelation. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall near the lampstand in the royal palace. Some think that this lampstand may have been the one taken from the temple in Jerusalem. We don't know for sure, but it's possible. God now directly intervenes. He didn't speak by vision or a dream, because this is a man he doesn't intend to reach. Suddenly, rarely does God ever respond so quickly, but on this occasion he did. The fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote. Some believe it was the same hand that wrote the 10 Commandments on the stone tablets for Moses. Some believe it was the same hand that wrote in the sand when the Pharisees and scribes brought the woman taken in adultery to Jesus. Both those cases, it was a case of forgiveness. For Belshazzar, it's a message of doom. What do you think? Can it be any doubt that this was the hand of God? No one expected anything like that. All restraints had been cast aside. The wine flowed freely. The sacred vessels of the temple were being desecrated, and the lifeless idols of paganism were being worshipped. Even though he could not read the writing on the wall, what effect did this have on Belshazzar? The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. I think Elvis wrote a song about that, didn't he? He was all shook up. Here's a man that commanded vast armies and was perhaps the wealthiest man in the world, but face to face with God in judgment, these provided no security or comfort. So what did he do? He did what those kings always did. He summoned, one translation said he cried aloud for his enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. What should he have done? It was time to confess his sins, repent, and call on the Lord, but he did not. He was too defiant and proud, so he made the same mistake his once pagan grandfather Nebuchadnezzar often made. He called for his ever-failing so-called wise men. The king summoned, one translation, as I said he cried aloud. And when they come in, he says, whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple, will have a gold chain around his neck, and will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. He couldn't replace Nabonidus. He wouldn't give up his place, so obviously the new ruler would be third in the kingdom. So all the king's wise men came in, but they couldn't read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified. His face grew more pale. I'm thinking all the color drained out of it. His nobles were baffled. They couldn't read it either. So he tried to regain his composure and get a grip on things, but it was a bumbling, stumbling effort at best. When he called in these enchanters, what he was offering them, clothed in purple, honor, gold chain, wealth, and status, the third highest place in the kingdom, if they could just read that. The failure of these wise men to read the writing on the wall just drove the intensity of the crisis higher. The pale, knee-knocking king was now terrified. For the third time in the book of Daniel, these wise men proved to be totally useless. As a result, the aspen color of his face grew even whiter or more pale, and no one could claim his great rewards because no one could tell him what he wanted to know. The queen, hearing the voices of the kings and nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said, very respectfully. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale." All the shouting and yelling and perhaps shrieks of terror caught the queen's attention. Now, who is the queen? Probably not the wife of Belshazzar. Daniel 5:3 tells us that his wife and concubines were already present. So, although it can't be said for certain, the queen was most likely the queen mother, the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, who was first married to Neriglissar and then to Nabonidus. But this queen, whoever she was, she comes into the banquet hall. She quickly sizes up the situation, and she begins to try to calm Belshazzar down. She had seen other crises, other times when the wise men were baffled, and knew this mystery was not impossible to solve. In verses 10 through 12, we learn that the queen comes to help her grandson out of his predicament. She tells him about a man in the kingdom by the name of who? Daniel, a spirit-filled man who can decipher the writing. Read with me verse 11. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, remember ancestor, grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means. Well, as the story continues, Daniel, now up in years, is brought before the king to interpret the strange message on the wall. As we see in Daniel's prelude to the translation of the message, King Belshazzar was guilty of failing to learn from his predecessor, Nebuchadnezzar, that pride goes before a fall. Remember how King Nebuchadnezzar wanted to take all the credit for all of that, and he went insane for a period of 7 years until he acknowledged that the God of heaven was the God and there was no other, and then things returned to him. He says, so Daniel was brought in before the king, and the king said to him, this is so interesting, are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? He didn't even know who Daniel was. But isn't it interesting, he called him by his Jewish name and not by his Babylonian name. It's obvious that Daniel did not hold the high position in this kingdom that he had previously held, and it's obvious that Belshazzar had never consulted him about anything.
What was his other?
What was what?
Daniel's other name.
Belteshazzar. That was his Babylonian name. Good question, Tony. Yeah. That was when they brought the young men over from Israel, they gave them Babylonian names. They tried to brainwash them through their schools, and by changing their names, they were trying to assimilate them into their culture, to make them forget their past and also not be in any way tempted to try to rebel against them. So, yeah, that's a good question. He goes on to say, I've heard the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I've heard that you're able to give interpretations and solve problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple, have a gold chain placed around your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom. Daniel, the man of God, was brought before the king. He was referred to as one of the Judean exiles, and as I said, the king called him by his Jewish name. Belshazzar goes on to recount the failure of his soothsayers and reaffirmed his offer of rewards if Daniel will just interpret the handwriting on the wall. Daniel answered the king, you may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Daniel here is unusually disrespectful to the king. We've never seen that in Daniel before. He immediately rejects the king's offers of rewards and gifts. He knew they wouldn't be worth much because he wouldn't be keeping them very long. We might say, what good is a promotion the day before your company folds? Right? And that's what he recognized here. Daniel knew that his wisdom interpretation came from God, and he would not exercise that gift in order to receive any earthly or kingdom gifts from anyone. You might note that in verses 8 through 18, God is referenced 4 times. Variously, he is called the Most High God, the Lord of heaven, and the God who holds your life breath in his hand and who controls the whole course of your life. Before Daniel interprets the handwriting on the wall, he gives this young king who is reigning under his father the best and probably only sermon he ever received. Daniel is not the young man who went into the presence of an old king. He's now an old man going into the presence of a young king. Listen to what Daniel tells Belshazzar. Your Majesty, the Most High God, gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. So Daniel begins by reminding Belshazzar the source of Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom, his majesty, his glory, his honor. He didn't earn this. He didn't deserve the things he had. Those were gifts of the Most High God. He was God's servant. Remember, we said back many years before he even was born, it was prophesied, and God called him my servant Nebuchadnezzar, and he would, excuse me, God would allow all of this to happen. He goes on to say, because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of languages dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. He killed anyone he wanted and kept alive anyone he wanted. He exalted anyone he wanted and humbled anyone he wanted. It'll be interesting when we get into our lesson next week to see the difference in the totally autonomous autocratic rule of Belshazzar and the shared rule of Cyrus and Darius. Just kind of keep that in mind as you study for next week. He reminds Belshazzar that Nebuchadnezzar had absolute power, and God had made him so powerful that no one could act against him or prevent him from doing anything he wanted or he wished. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. So the third thing Daniel points out to the young king is that of Nebuchadnezzar's sin. His heart was filled with arrogance and pride. He took sole credit for his accomplishments and believed everything he did was for his own glory. The purpose of Daniel's words was to show the trembling king that he had made the same mistake his grandfather had made, and he should have known better because he was there when this was happening. And furthermore, he had no right to expect to get away with it. Continuing, Daniel says he was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. So we see Daniel reminding Belshazzar what happened to his grandfather. God deposed him, caused him to go insane. He had the mind of a beast. He lived with the wild animals, as we studied, for a period of 7 years. And he emphasized to him that God controls all the kingdoms. He puts in position And to go along to kind of give you peace about this election, God puts in office the people he wants in office. Vote for whoever you want. Dan's comments this morning were very good. There are people like us, and they're entitled to different opinions from us. Sometimes, I know this won't sit well, but sometimes we are even wrong, you know? Okay. So, a basic and important theological principle is here, and let me just share this with you. Listen very carefully. Revelation brings responsibility. The more you know, the more responsible you are for what you know. That makes sense? So, he is saying to Belshazzar, you should have known from your grandfather and learned from his mistakes. It's your responsibility not to make those same mistakes, but to honor the God of heaven, which you haven't done. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you and your nobles, your wives and concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. We see here that Daniel's accusing Belshazzar of being an enemy of God by opposing and setting himself up against him. He accuses Belshazzar of committing a grave sacrilege by sending for the temple vessels and desecrating them at his drunken feast. He also accuses the young king of idolatry for praising the man-made gods that are deaf and dumb, while ignoring the God who held the king's ways and his life in his very hands. Now keep in mind that these harsh and embarrassing charges were levied against Belshazzar in front of all of his nobles and guests and their wives and others. Being king, he could have killed Daniel right then had he wanted to. He did all this before he read the inscription for him. He continues, therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. And the inscription was written, Mene Tekel Parson, and you may have a little different translation. It was written in Aramaic, and in Aramaic there are no vowels. So and there are no separation of words. What it would have looked like on the wall was MNMNTKLPRSN, with no gaps in between. And Daniel's first step, of course, would be to separate the words correctly into the appropriate word division, which he did. And the 4 words of the inscription read, numbered, weighed, divided. Not long ago I read an interesting story that kind of tied into this. You may enjoy this. There was a man who was a foreigner, recently come to our country, and still didn't understand English very well. His daughter had been going to church, and she persuaded him one Sunday to go to church with her. Unfortunately, on that particular Sunday, the preacher had chosen for his text the handwriting on the wall, Mene Tekel Parson. As soon as the preacher mentioned that, the man grabbed Minnie, his daughter, and dragged her out of the church. Father, what in the world is the matter? He said in a very heavy accent, Did you hear what that preacher said? He said, Minnie, come tickle the parson. So, as humorous as that may be to us, it wasn't very humorous here to Belshazzar. That's not the interpretation at all. Daniel provided a devastating interpretation in verses 26 through 28. This is what the word means. Many, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. God is closing the books on your kingdom, if you will. You challenged the Most High God and you lose. We have a common colloquialism today is his number's up, your number's up. And that's, I think, an accurate expression of the idea here. In Psalms 20:12, we read, "Teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom," which he did not do. Psalms 139:16, one of my favorite, "All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be." Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Belshazzar, you're a lightweight, and God's measuring standard proves it. God saw your sin just like he sees everyone's sin. You may enjoy sin for a season, but judgment is coming someday. And we too must remember a day is coming when every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. And so with knowledge comes responsibility. And if you're listening, you're watching, or you're here, the fulfillment of Scripture is inevitable. And if it is, and it is, if you're going to have to do that one day, why not do it in this life and receive salvation rather than wait for eternity and receive judgment? It's an individual choice. Today's the day of salvation. Don't miss it. Okay, verse 28, Parson, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. In other words, the head of gold is removed and the arms and chest of silver are taken its place. Well, after Daniel had interpreted, Belshazzar commanded him to be clothed in purple, a gold chain, and so forth and so on. If he was angry at Daniel, it doesn't show here, does it? Because he kept his word. He ignored Daniel's suggestion to keep the gifts himself or give them to someone else. And so I think if we go back from the time Daniel got to Babylon to his old age, we see constantly how God blessed Daniel throughout his whole life, and he blessed him for his faithfulness and his devotion and his standing up for God, no matter what the threat or the consequences might have been. Now here we have the end result. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylons was slain, Babylonians. But we have to rely on secular history to really learn how that happened. Cyrus was the commander of the combined army of the Medes and Persians. He was the son of King Cambyses I of Persia and Queen Mandarin, daughter of King Astyages of the Medes. So we had a marriage between the two kingdoms, the son from one kingdom, the daughter from another, and their marriage was a major factor in the alliance between the Medes and Persians and their combined army. Cyrus was a shrewd and compassionate leader. He would later become known as Cyrus the Great. Now this is the way it happened. About 2 weeks before this drunken party, Cyrus, commander of the Medes and Persians, started preparing for an invasion. And from the description of the city, by the way, 14 miles on the side is about like from here to Barberville. That's just one side, and it's laid out in a square. This is a big place, okay? And a high place. And he's preparing to invade it. So here's what he did. He divided his army, and he sent several thousand of his troops south of the city, near where the Euphrates emptied out from the city, and told them to stay there and stay out of sight. He put several thousand more to the north, near the river, stay out of sight, and wait until you see the water go down in the river. And this is what he did. Not too far from the Euphrates River was a big marsh or big swamp, and probably about 10 miles north of the city. So Cyrus had his troops dig a channel from the river to just within a few feet of a swamp. And he used all of that dirt they took from this channel, they piled up on the riverbank, and so he could use that dirt to dam up the river at the time he was ready. On the night of the invasion, he had some of his troops complete the unfinished part of the channel to the swamp. He had thousands of other troops pushing dirt into the river to block the flow of water. All of that sent the water flowing in a different direction. The riverbed emptied and the moat drained. That left the riverbed under the wall with no water. When the troops on each side of the city saw the water drop, they went under both walls of the city, killed the guards, lowered the drawbridge, and let in the rest of the army. Xenophon, the Greek historian, recorded that Cyrus and his men were on the inside of the inner city before the guards had even detected that anything was wrong. I read another account where it said it was days before some of the people ever learned that they had been conquered. And in such a vast kingdom there, you can understand that. This caught Belshazzar and his nobles by complete surprise. The handwriting on the wall had them rattled. The wine had them drunk. And as a result, they were unable to direct their army. Belshazzar was a proud, unrepentant pleasure seeker who was living under a false sense of security. He assumed he had everything under control. He provoked God, and in one night, his world empire fell. He failed to consider the power of God and was killed. And Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. Some of your translations or some of your history may identify him as Gabaru, but that's the same person. After Cyrus captured Babylon, Darius, who was actually king of the Medes, became king of the New World Empire. When he died 2 years later, Cyrus replaced him on the throne. And later we will learn that this was foreordained by God because this new empire would be instrumental in releasing the Jewish captives that Nebuchadnezzar had taken years before and would allow them to return to Israel, to Jerusalem, and the temple. The 70 years of captivity for violating the Sabbath year and for worshiping idols was coming to an end. So in this chapter we see two prophecies fulfilled. The first is the head of gold on Nebuchadnezzar's